When my nephew unexpectedly entered my room, I assumed I was simply unwinding there. We were talking normally until he did something that caught me off guard. Surprise! What transpired next was the most unexpected event of my life. Allow me to take you back to the beginning. Everything began while I was looking through my phone and heard a knock. At first, I assumed it was my nephew Kyle tapped me politely as usual to ask if I had seen his headphones, or even if I had his phone's charger. But this time it wasn't a fast knock, but more a slow, reluctant, and even anxious. I couldn't help but wonder why I had entered. My sister's kid, Kyle, was standing there when I yelled out and put my phone on the nightstand. The door cracked open. Was a decent child, intelligent, humorous, and respectful, yet he always had a quiet edge. At this age, when he was just beginning to venture out into the world, there was something that suggested he was carrying more than he actually did. His body had also evolved in a more mature manner, moving from the lanky I used to know an uncomfortable adolescent who developed into a more mature adult with broad shoulders and an unquestionable assurance that caused my breath to catch in my throat. I grinned and tried to speak in a casual tone. Hold off on the discomfort at bay. Kyle needs something, but he hesitated. His eyes darted back to mine as he looked at the floor. Yeah, I was just wondering if I could spoke to you for a moment. His tone wasn't his typical one. It was one of anxiousness. Assurance. It caused me to stop and consider what was going through his mind. Naturally, I gestured to the chair next to my bed and asked, "Sit down. What's on your—" Remember Kyle's SAT. But instead of looking me in the eye, his eyes kept flitting too. It was evident from the window, his shoes, and the door that something obviously upsetting him, but I wasn't sure why, so I folded my arms and waited for him to calm down. When he talked in a softer, almost hesitant voice than normal, and I've been feeling nice. He was 19 years old, and it's been strange lately how I inquired without seeming too worried. Ultimately, at that age, the world was likely a complex place. Yet just like with everything Kyle, there was something about his speech pattern that bothered me. Moved uneasily in his chair and he gave me a fleeting glance. Unreadable phrase, I'm not sure why. Something feels strange. I scowled a little since Kyle and I had always been friendly. But this was unexpectedly. We had never previously discussed our relationship in depth. It had always been rather unsaid. I assumed that he viewed me as an uncle, someone to trust, but never someone to think about it too much. But suddenly I could see his discomfort in front of me, and I was unable to ignore it, so I gently said, "What do you mean off?" I don't know why, but he moved again after I spoke carefully, his hands fumbling in his lap. Just recently, I've noticed that things feel different around you. Always felt that way, but I assumed it was only in my imagination. His voice cracked a little as he said, I didn't see the fragility that was beginning to seep into him. How to react, because his comments carried a weight that was both unsaid and odd. Recently there had been tension between us, and perhaps I had been attempting to ignore it as well. Kyle's lips pressed together, and for a considerable amount of time he remained there with his head falling slightly, as if I wanted to get in touch with him, because I was trying to find the right words to describe what was truly upsetting him, comfort him, but I wasn't sure how. After a lengthy silence, Kyle got up, his gaze locking with mine once more, but with a darker quality this time, intensity that I was unable to pinpoint. I'm not sure if this will assist, but I simply don't want things to continue as they are, he added softly, as if I can't continue to act like everything is fine if he were talking more to himself than to me. Typical when it seems like everything is shifting, and I observed him uncertain about how to Kyle. I started, but the tension between us had changed and I could sense his hesitancy in every part of me. Before I could continue, he turned away, his shoulders tensed, and he moved quickly and urgently in the direction of the door behind him clicked shut as he returned down the corridor, and I sat in the suddenly. My room was silent, and I felt as though I had missed something. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that I was overanalyzing everything, but the conversation kept coming back to me. The plot wasn't quite right, but I couldn't tell what it was. Over. But what followed left me paralyzed in a manner I had never encountered before the evening dragged on. As the home settled into its typical quiet rhythm, I attempted to concentrate on anything, but my thoughts kept returning to Kyle's remarks and his apprehensive demeanor. I had never witnessed him so. He seemed so insecure and fragile, and I couldn't help but wonder what stated that there was more to it than just our relationship. Had been prepared to acknowledge that I heard a knock on my door a few hours later when I was getting ready for bed. Was far later than normal. I was hesitant to open it, but something in the back of my mind told me. When I opened the door and saw Kyle waiting in the hallway, it was him once more. This time, he appeared more uncertain than ever. His face was shaking and his hands were Uncle blushed and added, almost hesitantly, "May I speak to you again?" I nodded. As he passed me, I moved aside to allow him entry, but his gaze never left the naturally. I whispered softly, "What's going on?" And he firmly swallowed his eyes. "I need to ask you something," he said, darting briefly to mine before turning away. As he spoke in a low, very tremulous voice, I cocked my head. Before I could even comprehend what was occurring, Kyle's hand reached out and I was perplexed, briefly touching my arm as though to test the waters, but it instantly sent a chill down my spine. My breath caught in a rush of warmth, and I drew back a little when his eyes met mine and my heart pounded in my chest, broad with doubt, but also with something more that caused my heart to race. Race. "I'm not sure what's going on," Kyle said in a whisper, his voice breaking as he moved in closer, "but I'm pulled to you. I can't explain it, but I feel like we have a connection that I can't ignore. My mind was screaming at me to stop this, but I was immobilized and unable to breathe, push him away, but my body didn't respond for some reason, and that's when it... In the instant that altered our relationship, he leaned in his lips, hardly touching mine in the most unexpectedly personal manner, and I was too astonished to resist the need to pull away. I should have done so as soon as his lips met mine, but I didn't. Kyle's kiss seemed uncertain and tentative, as if he was still in shock. Was doing, yet there was an indisputable quality to it that sent my heart was racing in unexpected ways due to my thoughts whirling out of control. Of his breath persisted as he drew back a little, looking at my face with his dark gaze. Uncertainly, "I apologize," he muttered, his voice trembling. "I'm not sure why." And I cut in just above a whisper. Wasn't sure if I was telling myself not to give in to Kyle's hands hovering close to mine or telling him not to apologize. The tension between us was awful, bearing down like a weight neither of us knew, while we waited for a response. How I could get out of my body feeling like it was burning, and for the first time in my life, I was unsure of the proper course of action. Ultimately, I couldn't said, taking a step back, but my body resisted my thoughts even as I was saying it. Kyle swallowed his expression while yelling at me that the words didn't feel right. I understand that he said it quietly, but the way he gazed at me like though he had just informed me that knowing didn't make a difference for a long time after crossing a line he wasn't sure he wanted to back off from. When neither of us spoke, there was a heavy charge in the air between us that I wasn't sure how handle clarify, and Kyle finally let out a shaky breath while stroking his hair. He whispered, "Go." And I nodded, unsure if I wanted him to. Slowed his pace as if he was waiting for me to intervene. But I didn't. I listened to his footsteps frozen in place and backed away along the hallway as my hands were shaking, and I hadn't realized I was holding my breath until the door snapped shut behind him. Stuffed my chest with feelings I wasn't prepared to deal with. Everything had changed, and I had no idea how to handle it, and that night I struggled to go asleep. Turned my thoughts to repeatedly relive the experience, the way Kyle's lips had. His breath had lingered across my skin, just touching mine, and there was an unmistakable pause and tension. Pull between us. I reminded myself that Kyle had made a mistake and was simply perplexed, that despite my repeated attempts to convince myself that my body recognized the truth, it didn't mean anything. My skin was still burning where he touched me, so my pulse had been racing. I tried to act normal the following morning, going about my daily activities as though nothing had occurred, as though my world hadn't changed in a way that I wasn't prepared for. But as soon as I saw Kyle, he looked up when I was absent-mindedly stirring his coffee at the kitchen table, and I realized something had changed. For a while, I believed he was walking in with his eyes sparking with something unsaid. He was about to say something, but instead he gave me a tentative little nod before I forced myself to move by clearing my throat as he returned his focus to his cup. As though this were just another typical morning, I walked past him to make my own coffee. However, I knew he noticed the heavy silence between us because my hands weren't stable. I had to say something to normalize this, since it was so painful. Kyle let out a low sigh as I inquired, "Sleep well?" in a tone that was too informal. His fingers drummed against the surface as though he had been holding it in, side of his mug restlessly, as if he were discussing something, and then he looked up at me, his face. I was hesitant, although his lips weren't actually pressed. He appeared as though he was considering saying something as his hands tightened over his mug, or not to mention the item that neither of us wanted to mention, and then eventually Kyle. "I know he started last night," and I stiffened up, twisting my gut. "I know what you're going to say, that it was an error that shouldn't have happened," he said, shaking his head. He spoke steadily, but I could hear the strain beneath it, so I forced myself to swallow. Kyle looked at me for a moment as my fingers tightened around my coffee cup, wasn't it? "I don't know," he confessed, a long pause before he sighed and ran a palm down his face. "Don't believe it was incorrect." My breath caught, and my heart slammed into my ribs. It would have been simpler if he had simply agreed with me, laughed it off, and claimed it was nothing, allowing me to bury it whatever I pleased. But instead, he was telling me that he felt it while he stood in front of me. Also, Kyle's comments paused between phrases, and I was suddenly at a loss for what to do. I should have stopped it immediately and informed him that he was heavy and dangerous. Incorrect, that what transpired had no significance, but the issue was that I didn't trust in myself. I exhaled deeply and set my coffee down on the "I'm not sure what you want me to say," Kyle countered, shaking his head and running a "I don't know either," he acknowledged, running his hand through his hair. "I simply can't." I averted my gaze and clenched my chest, as if it hadn't happened. Perhaps that's just what happened. Kyle gave a short breath, as if he was annoyed, but not with me. "What should we do?" "Himself, and is it what you desire?" His voice became softer and more cautious as he searched. I started to say yes, to put an end to this before it got any worse, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, Kyle took a stride while I stood there clutching the counter's edge as if it were the only thing holding me grounded. Before I saw it, I sensed it closer. The change in the atmosphere, the silent weight of his presence. My body responded before my thoughts could process it, causing my breathing to catch as I resisted the strong draw between us. "I need to know," he whispered. "Was it truly a mistake?" I gulped hard, my heart pounding. I was barely above a whisper. Every rational part of me screamed to push him aside to make room as my skin burned beneath the weight of his stare. Between us, prior to our crossing a new boundary from which we were unable to return, but the aspect of me that had never stopped. Considering that portion from last night was shouting something completely different. Kyle must have seen that his fingers brushed against mine before I could decide, which caused me to hesitate. I didn't move away from his breath, like if he was testing the waters. Hitched spoke the word, his voice rough-edged with desperation. "I want to stop this before it gets any worse, so tell me to stop, and I will." More difficult before I became overwhelmed with something I wasn't sure I could manage, but I remained silent, and Kyle accepted that as a response, and his hand moved completely over my, warming and stabilizing his. My heart was racing so much that I believed he could feel the weight of it with my fingers just tightening enough. Probably heard it, but I was still immobile and unable to focus due to the wave of emotions that was slowly washing over me. I should have stopped him when he leaned in gently, but I didn't. And when Kyle's lips first touched mine, I realized there was no turning back. He was tentative, yet persistent, as if he was still examining the boundary between doubt and belief. The moment dragged on slowly and intoxicatingly, as though we were both clutching the... I should have pushed away as we were holding our breath, waiting for the world to collapse around us. Have prevented this from getting worse, but the way his breath blended with mine and the warmth of his hand, when he eventually pulled back his forehead, it made me forget all the reasons I had told myself this was bad. His uneven breath resting against me tells me that this isn't real. Told me in a whisper, "Don't feel it too." I tightened my jaw and closed my eyes. I said, "Kyle, this is complicated," because it was too much to bear to see the silent hope in his eyes. He drew back a little, looking into my eyes to ask, "Why must it be?" I shook my head and laughed bitterly, since that's all Kyle did. I don't care, he flexed his fingers against mine as if he didn't want to let go. Acknowledged that I only know that I desire you, regardless of how complicated things are. His comments made me shudder, and I know you want me too. But he wasn't. I took a step back, creating space between us because I was mistaken about it, because I wasn't sure how long I could withstand him if I didn't. Kyle looked at me for a second, believing that I had spoken something, but my voice lacked conviction. His face became unreadable, and he nodded slowly before whispering, "Okay." But the expression in his eyes as he turned to leave my body, he screamed at me to stop him, pull him back, and forget, telling me he wasn't going to let this go. The weight of reality, but I chose to stand there and watch him frozen, vanish down the hallway with the knowledge that whatever this was, whatever we had just started, wasn't over, and that frightened me. The remainder of the day flew by, but I wasn't truly there, and anyhow. Kyle was reliving every detail, and I was stuck in that moment. When he told me he wanted me, I could feel his lips, his breath blending with mine, and the tremor in his voice. I kept telling myself that I had to get over the fact that it was an error that should never be repeated, but my body refused to listen. Whenever I closed my eyes, I saw him. Whenever I was by myself, I sensed the by-nightfall. The house was peaceful, and the phantom warmth of his touch had returned. I had avoided Kyle for the majority of the evening, keeping myself occupied with anything that would divert my attention, but I knew I couldn't stay away from him indefinitely, since the burden of everything unsaid was oppressive. Putting pressure on my chest every second, I told myself, I had to have the strength to establish limits, but I knew in my heart that I had already gone too far. I had just gotten into bed when I let him kiss me, and the faint light of my knock on my door was followed by the lovely shadows generated by my bedside lamp door. The door, my gut tightened instantly since I knew who it was, could have claimed to be asleep and ignored it, but my body cheated on me before I had time to consider that I was already standing and grabbing the doorknob. Kyle stood there looking. His hands were buried deep in his hoodie pockets, making it impossible to read. For a few while, neither of us spoke, extending like an invisible thread between us, brittle and unbreakable at the same moment. He finally exhaled and whispered, "May I enter?" Paused just a moment before moving aside and walking in his. He moved slowly, like if he wasn't sure what he was doing, and leaning against the door for support, I closed it behind him after my legs felt. At first, he didn't glance at me as he stood in the center of the room, but I could observe how his fingers contracted at his sides, seemingly keeping something back, and the stiffness in his shoulders. I swallowed hard when he acknowledged that I couldn't sleep, and that his voice was quieter than normal. The intensity in his eyes sent a chill down my spine when he finally turned to face me. Spine. Will we just act as if nothing occurred? I let out a long exhale. I honestly responded, "I don't know what," as I ran a hand through my hair. Kyle moved slightly closer so I could feel the heat emanating from his body. "And then we're meant to..." "Just for a little while," he said. Stop worrying about it. It was risky that my breath caught as he spoke, his voice encircling me like a secret I shouldn't have heard. This time, his fingertips did not lightly touch mine. Rather, it was purposefully slow, and it caused a spark to shoot up my arm, igniting my entire body. I was on edge and should have stopped him, but instead, as he drew closer, his breath ghosting, I let my fingers to tighten around his and let the warmth absorb into my skin, over my lips, and he kissed me again. But this time, I didn't Kyle's kiss. This time wasn't hesitant. Rather, it was gradual, yet assured. His lips pressed against mine with an unconscious understanding that neither of us dared to express, testing in a quiet, urgent manner, as though he was waiting for me to push him away. But instead, I drew him in closer, centering myself in his heat with my hands grabbing the material of his sweatshirt. Everything else diminished, even the doubt, the struggle, and the voice in the back of my head informing me that this was dangerous at the moment, with nothing but him and the warmth of his breath. The manner in which his hands slipped over my sides as though he wasn't sure if he was permitted to touch me, but couldn't resist, ought to have drawn back and established limits before we went over a line that we couldn't go back, but as soon as his fingers. When we eventually parted, I knew there was no turning back from the silent plea he made as he curled at the hem of my shirt. Before I could regain my breath, Kyle said, "I don't want to pretend anymore," resting his forehead on mine. He was breathing heavily against me, and his hands were still on me as though letting go would cause us to part ways. I could sense the strain in his body and the self-control it took for him to hold back, and the idea made me ache. With his questioning my desire for this as well, I forcefully swallowed and closed my eyes for... The words didn't come out in time for me to stop them, but I knew Kyle let out a sigh that sounded almost like relief, yet there was still... I opened my lips to respond, but he hesitated before telling me we weren't making a mistake. I didn't speak because I wasn't sure if this was an error or if we were standing here, enjoying the way his fingers move, yet putting ourselves in a situation we couldn't handle. I couldn't bring myself to regret it, even if I shivered a little against my skin, knowing he was as engrossed in this as I was. I ran my fingertip across his jawline, savoring his warmth rather than responding. Kyle leaned in once again, catching my attention, and the way his breath caught as I touched him was all the response he needed. His arms encircled me as his lips planted another kiss, deeper and more assured, drawing me in, and I gave in as I didn't want to fight my feelings for the first time in a long time. I wanted Kyle's hands to move slowly and deliberately, like he was scared. If he didn't hang on to it carefully enough, the moment would pass. His tentative hands touched my sides, but full of purpose, and every touch gave me a silent chill. The pressure of what we were doing ought to have forced me to quit before we really lost ourselves. However, I was only able to concentrate on him, the warmth of his skin through his hoodie's thin material, and the way his breath. Every time I approached him even a little bit more closely, I allowed my hands to trace up his arms, sensing the tightness there. His muscles and the self-control he was exercising in spite of everything that had just transpired caught my gaze. Searching for authorization, and for a few minutes we simply stood there in my bedroom's dim light, trapped in the I don't want to ruin the perfect balance between resistance and submission. Kyle's voice was rougher-edged and lower than before, and it made me sick to my stomach. "Titan, you're not me," said back in a whisper. Not even sure if that was true, but I needed him to hear it because, whatever this was, we had just entered, and neither of us could take it back. Kyle now firmly swallowed his Adam's apple. He said, "I don't know how to stop wanting this," as his fingers bobbed gently against my waist. His words were scarcely audible beyond a whisper, and they repeated identically what I'd been thinking, and before I could respond to Kyle, I wasn't sure how to stop, or even if I wanted to. Closed the gap once more, pressing his forehead against mine. His hands were clutching me, and his breath felt warm on my lips, tightening his grip on me as if he was worried that I would vanish if he let me go and told me to. He said, his voice trembling, and I opened my mouth to respond. The words to shoo him away before we crossed a boundary that would never be uncrossed, but I chose to murmur instead. Kyle can't release a trembling breath before his lips firmly touch mine once more. This time he was more convinced that his touch was free of hesitancy. His hands slipped to my back as he second-guessed, drawing me completely against him, and I let him go, because I only wanted him and didn't care about the repercussions. Kyle's fingers pressed against my back as he tightened his hold on me, drawing me closer until our bodies fit together. Every part of me was conscious of him in a way that made my veins burn. His hands trembled quietly as his chest rose and sank against mine. Every time my fingers touched his flesh, his breath caught. There was no longer any reluctance, only the uncertainty that had lasted until the restraint that we had both attempted to maintain vanished. His lips pressed against me, and whatever this was, whatever we had just let, it was real and unstoppable, profound and in-depth, as though we were committing ever moment of this to memory. Something more profound than recollection. I felt his warm hands move up my sides, and steady, giving me a chill that was entirely related to the silence and had nothing to do with hesitation. Tremendous need between us. I ought to have considered the repercussions, contemplating the implications of this for us. But I was absorbed in the way he touched me and the way his hands gripped my waist as if he was unable to let go when we eventually parted ways. Breathless, Kyle pressed his forehead to mine and closed his eyes as if he was trying to process what had just happened. I could feel his heart beating quickly against my chest, reflecting my voice was almost audible above a whisper as I acknowledged, "I don't know where this leaves us." Kyle chuckled softly, although I know I don't. He didn't say anything. Want to stop. So I forcefully swallowed while keeping my fingers on his shirt like, "This is complicated," I said, and I was scared to back off. But even as the words left my lips, even though I knew they were weightless and that I wasn't pushing him away. In order to avoid this, Kyle slightly withdrew his fingers from my arms before his eyes met mine as he rested lightly against my hands, and there was something silent but, "I just know I want to be with you," he added, "so I'm not sure I care." Something unsaid but indisputable was settling between us as a result of his comments, and I wasn't sure how we were expected to handle this or what the responses meant for the future. But in that, as Kyle stood in front of me, his hand still clasped around mine, I came to a realization I didn't want to fight this much longer, or perhaps we would figure it out, or perhaps this was just the start of something unexpected. However, as of just now, I just knew that I couldn't let him go, and the days following that night felt like a sluggish untangling. What had been an unsaid bond that was exciting and unknown now felt like a burden we didn't know how to carry. We had gone too far, and Kyle still couldn't go back no matter how much we wanted to. Gazed at me as if I were something that God and he couldn't let go of. I wanted to think that we could survive this fleeting moment that we had stolen. Eternity, yet the reality hovered above us, intruding at the corners of every look, every unintentional touch, every moment of silence that seemed a bit too long. He was sitting in the dimly lighted living room one evening, lost in concentration, staring at nothing. I hesitated in the doorway, my chest constricted. He didn't look like the Kyle I'd always known. Realized that there was something weighty and cracking in his eyes. He must have sensed my presence because he turned to face me, and for a little moment, I believed he was going to tell me what was on his mind, but then he simply shook his head and breathed softly, as though to himself, "I think we made a mistake." Spoken. The words struck me more forcefully than I had anticipated, and I made myself swallow the, "I've been thinking about it a lot, Kyle." And he went on with his. He spoke in a softer tone now, explaining what this meant for what would happen next. Sour laugh while stroking his hair, "And I don't believe there's a..." My stomach began to churn, but I made myself remain motionless so I could listen. My heart was screaming for me to stop him, but he finally said, We can't keep acting like this is something we can control. Making eye contact with you, I don't want to injure you or myself. However, this doesn't work out well for either of us, and I detested how logical I was waiting for one of us to be strong, and I hated that I had been telling myself the same thing. Enough to say it aloud. But now that he did, Kyle, I don't know why, it seemed like the earth was giving way under me. I wanted to tell him that I didn't care that we could work it out, but my voice faltered. He grinned and said, "We don't have to let this go," but the words wouldn't come because I knew deep down that he was right. However, it wasn't a joyful smile. Rather, it was something shattered and resigned. "We will never forget that night," muttered as like he was trying to persuade himself, and I looked at him, remembering every detail of his face, the gradually waning warmth in his gaze, and the way his hands clenched his fists as if to prevent himself from grabbing me one final time. And then suddenly, Kyle stood up, but he paused for a little moment. He seemed to be waiting for me to interrupt him, so he could say something that would ease the situation. But I was unable to do so. I sat there looking at the empty spot where he had been when the door clicked shut behind him. Felt as though I had lost something I had never truly had. Perhaps in a different life or universe we might have enjoyed more than a brief moment if we had worked this out. But this wasn't that reality. Was reality.